Boeing Starliner astronauts launched to the International Space Station on June 5th, 2024, with an anticipated mission of around 8 days. They will return to Earth in February of 2025 on a SpaceX Crew Dragon with a mission length of around 8 months. Let's break down what went into this decision, why NASA ultimately decided the risks with Boeing Starliner were too great, what the astronauts might be feeling, and whether I think Boeing Starliner will ever be an operational spacecraft. I'm Swapna Krishna, and today here on Ad Astra, we're going to talk about Boeing Starliner. I want to start with a really good quote from Bill Nelson, the administrator of NASA, about this flight, because NASA has done an amazing job making people think spaceflight is safe, easy, and routine. And in reality, it is none of those things. Senator Nelson said, quote, "Spaceflight is risky, even at its safest, even at its most routine. And a test flight, by nature, is neither safe nor routine." Now, let's talk about how all of this is going to work. Boeing Starliner will undock autonomously in early September. Chatter has been that the date that's currently being looked at is September 6th, but there hasn't been anything official from NASA. They're just maintaining that it will be early September. There's a window every 4 days for Starliner to re-enter. Engineers are currently working on some software configuration changes to allow Starliner to undock autonomously rather than with crew. A lot of to-do has been made about this, but it's basically just updating what's called the mission data load to tell it that crew won't be on board. It takes time, not because there are huge software changes, but because of the immense amount of testing involved with sending anything to a spacecraft. NASA is planning on changing the separation procedure, basically to get Starliner away from the ISS more quickly, but the undocking itself will go normally, as will deorbit and re-entry. Starliner will jettison the troublesome service module before re-entry and then land at White Sands Test Facility. Crew 9 will launch on a SpaceX Crew Dragon no earlier than September 24th with 2 crew members. We don't know which 2 crew members those will be. That announcement will come later. There will be 2 empty seats and 1 extra launch and entry suit aboard. NASA has already determined that there is an extra SpaceX suit aboard the ISS that will fit one of the crew members, so only 1 needs a suit. Butch and Suni will assume the duties of Crew 9, and they will be on the ISS until that scheduled return date in February 2025. This sounds like a huge deal, but in terms of spaceflight, mission extensions, even of this length, are relatively routine. For example, NASA astronaut Frank Rubio spent 371 days on the ISS, finally returning home in September 2023. His mission was extended over 6 months because of a leaky Soyuz capsule. This specific Starliner mission extension is getting a lot of attention because it's Boeing versus SpaceX, but really, mission extensions aren't a huge deal when it comes to astronauts. But the question is, how did NASA come to this decision? What information did they weigh when making it? It was very interesting to hear from NASA officials that this decision was disappointing for them. All of them really were invested in the mission and wanted to complete it as originally envisioned. But it was also a unanimous decision to bring Butch and Suni home on a SpaceX Crew Dragon instead of Boeing Starliner. I talked a lot about how NASA weighs risk and NASA culture post-Columbia in my latest video. You can watch that if interested. But it was incredibly reassuring to me to see the leaders of NASA cite the culture that led to 2 space shuttle tragedies as one of the things they kept in the front of their minds when making this decision for Boeing Starliner. Even Administrator Nelson specifically said that the agency lost 2 space shuttles as a result of there being a culture where people couldn't come forward and offer dissenting opinions. The decision-making around Boeing Starliner has included a lot of dissenting opinions. I have followed the ins and outs of this mission extensively for years, through the uncrewed test flights way before CFT launched. And I do think bringing Butch and Suni home on a SpaceX Crew Dragon is the right decision. Let's dive into why. Briefly, there are two big problems with Starliner. First are the helium leaks, which have gotten most of the attention. The spacecraft sprung 5 helium leaks during the period before launch to when it docked with the ISS. However, this honestly hasn't been a huge concern over the past few weeks. We didn't even hear about it at the press conference. But what NASA and Boeing have specifically been looking at is the thruster failures, which all tie back to overheating. All of these thrusters are located within Boeing Starliner's service module, which does not come back to Earth. It's jettisoned before re-entry. Starliner's service module has 20 OMAC thrusters and 28 RCS thrusters. The OMAC thrusters are the more powerful ones, orbital maneuvering thrusters, while the RCS thrusters are for smaller adjustments, holding attitude, that sort of thing. Starliner needs a combination of both to maneuver in space. These thrusters are located in what are called doghouses around the capsule. There are 4 of them, each of which has a thruster pack of 5 OMAC and 7 RCS thrusters. Starliner had issues with thruster failures and low thrust, but the failure itself isn't the problem. It's the root cause of the failure, overheating in these doghouses. This is really what they've been zeroing in on over this past week of testing. Basically, when the OMAC thrusters fire, the doghouses heat up much more than they should, and the other individual thrusters absorb that heat. This, in turn, causes bulging in Teflon seals as well as the vaporization of propellant. That bulging reduced the amount of oxidizer getting to the thrusters, which was why there were low thrust issues. Essentially, the thrusters just weren't getting enough fuel, and the Teflon was damaged. It was unclear what repeated thruster firing, what kind of damage that would do. The bottom line is what the on-the-ground testing at White Sands demonstrated to NASA was that the thrusters were operating in an environment that was hotter than what they were really designed for. And given the heating that they encountered before docking with the ISS, it was unclear how these thrusters would act and whether they would fail on the return. Now, Boeing did see some thruster problems on the uncrewed test flights OFT-1 and 2, but the thrusters have experienced significantly more heating on this crewed flight test. That means that the data from the deorbit and reentry of those flights can't really be taken into account here because there's a lot more concern about how the thrusters will behave from that additional heating. Basically, the question is, will these thrusters fail during return? It's possible that with enough testing, Boeing and NASA could have gotten to a point where they were confident that would not happen. But there was a time crunch. NASA wanted to undock Starliner in early September, and it became clear that they would not be able to get a definitive answer by that deadline. So the only option really was to just return Starliner uncrewed. So then, the big question, what does this mean for the future of Boeing Starliner? That is not clear as of right now. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson said that he was 100% confident that Starliner would launch again with crew on board. Boeing has a new CEO now, Kelly Ortberg, and Senator Nelson made it clear that he had spoken with Ortberg, and both NASA and Boeing continue to be committed to Starliner. But NASA is working with Boeing on a fixed-price contract. That means NASA paid Boeing for some of the development for Starliner and a certain number of operational flights. But any cost overruns due to schedule delays or anything else are Boeing's responsibility. Let's break it down. In total, NASA has paid almost $3.3 billion to Boeing for Starliner development costs, as compared to around $2.6 billion for SpaceX Crew Dragon. These numbers are from the Planetary Society, and they're through the end of 2023. According to CNBC, Boeing has lost $1.5 billion on Starliner. As far as we know, they have no other customers currently, besides NASA. While SpaceX Crew Dragon has the Axiom missions, they have Polaris Dawn with its first private spacewalk, as I talked about in my recent video. So there's not much of a way to recoup that loss with Starliner as it is right now, and we are quickly approaching the end of life of the ISS. And now, of course, it's possible that there will be a life extension for the ISS past 2030. But before this crewed flight test, the earliest an operational mission for Starliner could have been was 2025. Now we're looking at more like 2026. How many missions can Boeing Starliner realistically fly before there's nowhere for NASA to go in low Earth orbit? To be clear, NASA is not going to retire the ISS before there are private space stations in low Earth orbit to pass the torch to. For more on that, check out my video on deorbiting the ISS. There are a lot of questions here, but I will say that Administrator Nelson is much more certain of Boeing's continued participation in Commercial Crew than I am. Boeing has lost so much money, and they will continue to lose so much money, especially when you consider that they may have to pay for a second crew test flight before they can begin operational flights to the ISS. The language in the Boeing Commercial Crew contract seems to indicate that they do need to return with crew in order for Starliner to be certified for operational flight. NASA has declined to comment on whether they would be able to certify Starliner now that it is coming back uncrewed. It's clear they want to. After NASA's experience with Shuttle, they do not like having only one way to ferry astronauts to and from low Earth orbit. And given geopolitical tensions and Russia's own space program woes, they don't want to rely on the Soyuz too much. That means having two separate spacecraft to launch astronauts to the ISS and bring them home from low Earth orbit. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is to NASA, and that's a thing you need to keep in mind when considering Boeing Starliner. That means they want to have an operational Boeing Starliner. They want to certify Boeing Starliner. They wanted to send Butch and Suni home on Starliner. But can they? Is that safe? That's what they have to determine. They do think at this point Boeing does have enough information to find mitigations on the thruster issues for future flights, but they will not commit to either certifying Boeing Starliner based on this flight or having a second crewed flight test at this moment. And that's fair. Right now, they are more focused on bringing the uncrewed Starliner capsule home. But there are still a lot of questions for the future, despite the agency's current position that they do wholeheartedly think that Starliner will eventually be an operational spacecraft. The fact that at the Saturday press conference, Administrator Nelson cited SLS, the boondoggle of a rocket for the Artemis program that is a mess on basically every level, as evidence that Boeing does good work is really not reassuring. I'll have a deeper look at SLS hopefully later this week, maybe next week. Okay, so finally, let's talk about these astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, who went up anticipating an 8-day mission and will now be on the ISS for 8 months. How are they doing? So I know it's hard to believe, but they're probably fine. I've seen this mission extension likened to getting stuck somewhere horrific during travel, but astronauts actually train for and expect this sort of thing. I am sure they have feelings about it. I'm sure their families have feelings about it too. They're probably frustrated. But also, this is the job and the life of a NASA astronaut, and they know that when they become astronauts. Mission extensions are absolutely a normal part of the job. They've trained for all kinds of contingencies, and this is just one of them. As far as health, we know what about 13 months on the ISS will do to the human body. They will be on the ISS for a shorter period of time than that. The agency is very interested generally in how long-duration spaceflights affect astronauts, but also have done a lot of work at mitigating those negative effects. For example, Butch and Suni are doing 2 to 3 hours of exercise a day minimum while up there. Normal ISS assignments are for 6 months. Theirs will be just a couple of months longer than that. The ISS also carries about a 4-month extra supply of consumables, food, clothing, that sort of thing. There are also regular resupply missions. There's one just a couple of weeks ago that launched on August 4th. When the agency realized that it was a possibility that Butch and Suni would extend their stay, they opted to add extra consumables to that flight. These resupply missions happen at regular intervals, so you don't need to worry about anyone going hungry. So that is where we stand right now on Boeing Starliner. I am very, very interested to see what happens during the undocking and re-entry of Boeing Starliner and the tests that come after that. Will we see more thruster failures during the deorbit burn? That being said, we do know that manual control of Starliner puts more stress on the thrusters and heats them up more than automated control. But if there's anything to report from that reentry, I will have another mission update after that return in early September. But for now, that is about all I have to say about the continuing Boeing Starliner saga. It has been a long few months, probably even longer for Butch and Suni, and I am guessing there's some real relief at finally having certainty about how and when they will come home. In the meantime, thank you for watching. I am Swapna Krishna, and this is Ad Astra.